Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. And today I have the somewhat surprise pleasure of speaking with Shane Claiborne, head of the Simple Way Ministry based in Philadelphia. And admittedly, I have been a critic of Shane for many, many years, and he is very gracious and courageous to come on to have a direct conversation, which I've been looking forward to. And so Shane, tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of your church background and the major intellectual and spiritual influences that shaped your vocation and how you came to be in the work that you're in these last 15 years or so.
Yeah, man. Well, thanks again for reaching out to me. I'm always glad to have a conversation together, and I learn a lot from folks that disagree with me. And for me, I grew up down south in East Tennessee, actually. In this pandemic, I've been doing some of the ancestry thing because my wife found out it's free right now, and so we're doing this little trial. So my people are from the hills, like in Cage Cove, the Smoky Mountains, and so I grew up down there. Fell in love with Jesus when I was kind of middle school age, and really started my own spiritual journey out of that. I grew up Methodist, as I was telling you before we kind of started recording here, and I really I've been shaped by a lot of those Wesleyan roots. I love, John Wesley, the fire, that's on sometimes I would joke that it's on the Methodist hymnals, but you don't always see it in every Methodist church. But that, Wesleyan fire, and his commitment to poor folks and to seeing the gospel as something that impacts how we hold our possessions. I sometimes quote his, he said, if I find money in my hands, I get rid of it as quick as I can before it corrupts my heart. And of course, John Wesley said, if I die with more than 10 pounds, may every person call me a liar and a thief. So that, that's some beautiful stuff. I also think the Methodist Church, and now I've been doing a lot of work around the death penalty, and the Methodists have one of the strongest statements around the death penalty, and that capital punishment undermines the redemptive work that Jesus did on the cross and the possibilities of redemption. So I love that statement. But anyway, I went from Tennessee, came up to Philadelphia. I got involved in the charismatic movement because I really loved this sense that God is alive in the world, and the Spirit is available to us and lives inside of us. So I got rebaptized and got involved in a Pentecostal church. Still kind of kept my Methodist roots, and then of course now I've been mentored by Catholics and got a lot of friends here in Philly who are Quakers. So I'm a bit of a spiritual mutt, man. But I've mined some of those different treasures of the church that are, have different traditions, and most of the kind of denominational histories. I think we've got some bones that need to be spit out anyway, but from each of them. But there's some real gems to embrace. So I've, that's kind of how I've been shaped. And as far as people that have spoken into my own journey, boy, there's sure so many. I'm sure, like you, Mark, I've got on my wall here St. Francis of Assisi, who's one of those inspirations for me, and Dr. King, that's his jail shot there, and Dorothy Day over here, and there's a lot of different folks that I think have really influenced how I think of my faith, so that's a little of my backdrop. I've been living here in Philly for over 20 years now. We've got this little community across the street there. You can see that's where we started our community 20 years ago. And we were really inspired by the early church too, in the book of Acts, where it says no one claimed any of their possessions were their own, but they shared everything they had. They worshiped in their homes. It's this kind of beautiful sense of the gospel being lived out of dinner tables and living rooms, and not so much the mega church, but the micro church. And that's kind of what we've been building here for 20 years. We've got a neighborhood community. We often say we started an intentional community, but it formed a village, and we've got murals and community gardens and all kinds of stuff going on these days.
Well, you did self-identify as an urban monastic, but you got married a few years ago, so I guess you're no longer monastic in that sense.
Well, I did get married. Yeah, it was never something that was my primary language that was monastic. Because if I said, we're a new monastic community to my neighbors, that doesn't mean anything to everybody. Some of them just might say, I know you're a little nasty, but, take a shower or something. But I think that like that history of monasticism is a wonderful one. The desert monastics that kind of in the period of Constantine, and when the church was kind of getting confused, they went to the desert to sort of build a new society and to shelve the old one. And a lot of the monastic movements like St. Francis and Clare and Assisi, they were youth movements that were correcting where the church had kind of gotten it wrong and maybe become a little too contaminated by the principalities and powers and lost the heart of the gospel. So that's kind of what we're after, and these days, as you know, I do a lot of my work within Red Letter Christians, which is referring back to the old Bibles that have the words of Jesus highlighted in red. And there came a point where we said, man, let's just start reading the Sermon on the Mount again. Let's read the words of Jesus and try to live our lives as if he meant the stuff he said. So that's what we've been after.
Now, well, you are a leading Christian exponent of nonviolence, and it's on that issue that we've often challenged you, in that typically most of Christianity has made the argument that to have a good society where people can live in relative peace and justice, you need to have a military, you need to have a judiciary, you need to have police and jails and prisons to uphold some sense of order, and God has ordained that order. So how do you define Christian nonviolence, and do you recognize the providential purposes of, say, law enforcement?
Yeah, well, there's a book that comes to mind that our friend Ron Sider wrote here, Mark. I don't know if you've seen this one, but the early Church on Killing. And this is really just the words of the early Christians in there. And what it shows is how consistent their ethic of life is. In the first few hundred years of Christianity, Christians were passionate champions for life, and they spoke consistently against violence in every manifestation that it had. This book has a whole chapter on abortion, and they were passionately against abortion. It's got a whole chapter on militarism, and they spoke unilaterally against killing in war and militarism. There's a whole chapter on the death penalty because they were passionately against the death penalty. Of course, they were also dying from the death penalty, so that probably helped light that fire. But they spoke against the gladiatorial games. This kind of romanticizing and celebration of violence. So I really take some of my cues from that, and this language that has helped us through the centuries of a seamless garment or a consistent ethic of life. And I came to see in my own upbringing, I grew up with guns. I grew up in a military family. I grew up for the death penalty, arguing all the scriptures that I thought justified the death penalty. But I kept leaning into Jesus, and there's something that just didn't, that was hard to reconcile with some of those ideologies. The irony is, I think that we, in America, we can say we're pro-life and still be pro-guns, pro-military, pro-death penalty, and anti-life on a lot of the other issues. And we just narrowly focus what it means to be pro-life on abortion. That we might be more accurate to say I'm pro-birth or I'm anti-abortion. So that's been the challenge, that I've been pushed with, even personally, to have a more consistent ethic of life and to say every single person is made in the image of God, and whatever destroys life is on the wrong side of God. These are people that are made in the image of God and their life matters. So it's why I care about gun violence and the death penalty and war and militarism, is that Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they're the children of God. And I still think, it's an idea where it's an aspiration. It's not always what comes naturally to me. I'm a little bit of a zealot. So I can't say I would respond nonviolently in every situation, but I can sure say I would aspire to. And I believe that's what Jesus calls me to. So, I think of old Peter, who, when the soldiers came to get Jesus, he picked up a sword and cut off one of the guy's ears. And Jesus, his response is stunning. He scolds Peter and says, put your sword away. Enough of that. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. And then he picked the ear up and healed the man that Peter had wounded. And the power of that, to me, is just unmistakable. In Tertullian and so many of the early Christians, they really went back to that story. And Tertullian said, when Jesus disarmed Peter, he disarmed every Christian. Because really, if there was a case for using violence in a redemptive way, Peter sure had a strong argument for it. But Jesus is showing us another way. And I really believe that it's impossible for me to love my enemies and simultaneously prepare to kill them. And I think, the cross and the gun give us two really different versions of power. And one says, I'm willing to die, and the other says, I'm willing to kill. And I just think it's really difficult to try to hold those, the cross in one hand and a weapon in the other. And there is something worth dying for, but nothing that I would kill for. And that's that, perfect love is no better version than being willing to lay down our life for another. But I think the moment that we try to use violence, we end up mirroring the very thing that I think God wants to heal the world of, that violence that goes all the way back to Cain and Abel.
Do you believe that faithful Christians can serve in law enforcement and the military? And do you believe it's possible God has callings for different people for different purposes? Maybe some are called to nonviolence. Maybe others are called to purposes that may include violence in some circumstances.
It's a great question. I think that John Yoder and Walter Wink and other folks have really wrestled with that. I personally, when I look at the early church, one of the debates that they had, they held out that people can be in the military, and of course in the third or fourth century, your military folks weren't just fighting wars; they were building social infrastructure, roads and aqueducts and other things. So it was very conceivable to think you could be in the military and still not kill. And that was really what some Christians came out to say, is that you can be in the military as long as you commit not to kill another person, to not fight in a war, that our fidelity to Jesus means that we're not going to use violence even in war. And so there's so many wonderful examples of that in church history. So I do believe that once we choose Jesus, we also, that is a call to love our enemies and to not use violence. So I don't see a way to justify violence in any form. I think that someone can serve in non-combatant roles, and but to follow Jesus creates collisions, I think, with some of those identities. And that's why Hippolytus and others, when you got baptized, your new life in Christ meant a renunciation of your old life. And I think we would agree that if you own an adult bookstore and you become a Christian, you want to rethink the job, but somehow we don't extend that to roles where violence is used, or working for companies like Lockheed Martin that are some of the biggest proliferators of violence and war in the world, military companies that are building weapons that cost massive amounts of life. So I have a close friend that works for one of those companies that has really wrestled with his own vocation. You know, can I be a Christian and work for a company like Lockheed Martin? And I think those are questions that the church is, when we are calling people to make disciples of Jesus, that means some careers are incompatible with those calls that we see as central to the gospel.
You, of course, are very active in opposing the death penalty. And of course, your goal is to abolish the death penalty altogether. And you are pro-life. Would you legally restrict abortion? And to what extent would you restrict it if it were up to you?
Well, first of all, I did get, you know, I got involved in the death penalty partly because I saw that there were lots of Christians that were vocal on abortion and other issues, but on gun violence and the death penalty, we actually haven't been the champions of life. We've been the obstacles. And that's why I wrote a book around both of those, because I saw, you know, on the death penalty wouldn't stand a chance in America if it weren't for Christians. And the Bible Belt is the death belt, you know, where 85% of the executions happen is in the Bible Belt. It's also the states that held on to slavery the longest. But that became very problematic to me because I think one of the questions that's raised by the death penalty they're very deeply theological questions, right? Like, is anybody beyond redemption? And how much do we trust imperfect human institutions like our government with the irreversible power of life and death? And of course, with gun violence, Christians own guns at a higher rate than the general population. The highest gun owning demographic in America is white evangelicals. So that, you know, that kind of following Jesus on the one hand and the cross and owning a gun, I think particularly advocating for the legality of assault weapons and things like that has been a big passion of mine, because I agree. To me, those are very personal. Like, every corner of our neighborhood, we have the stories of who died from guns there. So it's not just a debate to me. It's I think proximity makes a world of difference. And I would say that on the death penalty, I mean, on abortion, Mark, too, is that one of my heroes is Mother Teresa, who I've got here on my wall too. But she, one of the things I admire about her is how consistent her passion for life was. And she was passionately against abortion, as you know. But she was also passionate about the death penalty, and she'd call governors up the night before an execution. She spoke out passionately about the violence and the impact of war. And so when I went to India, I worked with her, and I worked in the orphanages that she started. And what struck me, Mark, was that to be pro-life for Mother Teresa was not just about bumper stickers and t-shirts. In fact, I don't even know that she had any of those, but it was about taking in kids that were abandoned in train stations. It was about taking in 14-year-old moms that didn't know what they were going to do. And so in some ways, I think we need more than ideologies, and we need to take responsibility of what a love of our neighbor looks like. And in my neighborhood, that's what pro-life looks like. If we're going to tell someone they shouldn't have an abortion, then we need to be able to build a community around them and support them. So it is something I care deeply about, eradicating abortion. And I think the language, the problem is in our partisan politics, you don't have a party or a candidate that's very consistent. I think even in the last election, Hillary Clinton, the leading candidate for the Democratic Party, she was for the death penalty, and she had a terrible track record on abortion. And then on the other side, Donald Trump, I mean, his life ethic is just an absolute train wreck on almost everything. So I didn't find a home very easily in that, as one who cares about, is pro-life for all of life, from the womb to the tomb. I think that we can do a better job at reducing abortions, and healthcare is a part of that, having more support of those who are really vulnerable. And just as I'm not I don't think like legalization is the primary lens I think of. Like I don't think the answer to our gun problem is just to overturn the Second Amendment. I don't think the answer on abortion is just to overturn Roe versus Wade. I do believe that we all have to be asking, how can we do a better job at protecting life? And I think a lot of times we've been better at protecting guns than protecting lives. And I think sometimes for folks on the left, the conversation has just been about rights and not about life and the dignity of the child and of the mother. How do we really try to be a stronger advocate for life? And I think on the other hand, you know, some of the rhetoric from folks on abortion has been a hindrance to actually reducing abortions in real ways by just having ideology that that's so polarizing in our country. So I think we need a better conversation around abortion, but we also need a better conversation on what a consistent ethic of life could look like. I'm considering writing a book on that, so I might tap you if I need to have a conversation partner, Mark.
I look forward to it. And finally, Shane, obviously you're associated with the left side of Christianity. I would be associated with the right side of Christianity. Where do we intersect, and are there commonalities where we could, if not collaborate, at least have common conversations about the common good?
Well, I hope that, first of all, I'm not very comfortable with those labels of left and right and conservative and liberal. I find them really unhelpful. Depending on who you talk to, some of my friends would tell you I'm very conservative and some of my friends would tell you I'm very liberal. But I like how Chesterton said, if I'm too conservative for the liberals and too liberal for the conservatives, I might be right where I'm supposed to be. But I find that some of these things are not about left and right, but they're about right and wrong. And a couple of things I hope we would find common ground on, Mark, is that what is surfacing in our country around this era of Donald Trump is very, very troubling. And someone has said that Trump didn't change America, he just revealed America. And I think the pandemic isn't just showing like, the pandemic didn't break America, it just showed how America was already broken. So we're seeing a lot of that. But I think when I look at things like the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, I'm very concerned about the policies and the rhetoric of Trump and the Christians who defend him, because so much that he does looks very little like the fruits of the Spirit and very much like the 7 deadly sins. And when I look at the Beatitudes of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, I'm very concerned. It's actually my love for Jesus that creates my deep concern about Trump and those who enable him. So to me, I think we've got a lot of challenges in our country right now. And some of this is about the different lenses we see the world through based on our social location. So there's a major fault line of race in our country. Even as we think about the 80% or so that voted for Trump and continue to defend him of white evangelicals, over 70% of non-white Christians are opposing him. And so there's a racial fault line that I think when people hear "Make America Great Again," you sort of ask, what does that look like for a person of color? What era of American history would a Black person want to relive? And you understand why many people, when they hear "Make America Great Again," they hear "Make America White Again." That there's this sort of fragility of white power that has dominated so much of the policies and rhetoric in our country. And on the back of the first Black president, we see this sort of white lash, this lashing back of that, and white supremacy in so many different forms. So to me, the answer is going back to Jesus, and I look at Jesus and I see the things that he said. I see what Jesus blessed in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor, the meek, the merciful, the peacemakers. And those are the things that Jesus blessed. And those are the things, the people that in many ways the policy of this current administration is cursing. So when I read Jesus in the sermon, or in Matthew 25, in the sheep and the goats, he says, in the end, we're all going to be gathered before God. And we're going to be asked, not just doctrinal questions, but we're going to be asked, when I was a stranger, did you welcome me in? And that's got some really important implications when it comes to welcoming asylum seekers and refugees and immigrants. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was sick, did you make sure I was cared for? So I think that our works don't earn our salvation, but they do demonstrate it. And so I think, Matthew 25 is a litmus test of how we're doing as a country. And as individuals. And I'm very concerned because I don't think we're doing a very good job at taking care of the least of these. And in the end, God doesn't care how the Dow is doing. God cares how the poor are doing.
Shane Claiborne, head of the Simple Way in Philadelphia. Thank you so much for this conversation. As mentioned, you've been on the receiving end of a lot of critique from me and IRD over the years. So it was a welcome break from that to engage with you directly. And I hope our conversation will continue. Come visit us sometime when you're in DC, when normalcy hopefully returns.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you. Hey, Mark, can I say one more thing? You can stop the recording or keep going, whatever. But I just wanted to say that I think one of the other things I hope we could agree on is the toxicity of self-righteousness. And I'm very concerned. I mean, I could show you emails that I get from the left and the right that have a very similar tone. And I hope that you and I and others can be a part of modeling better conversation and disagreeing well. Because self-righteousness, I think, is nonpartisan. And it's Jesus called it the yeast of the Pharisees. And I think it does so much damage when we say, thank you that I'm not like those people. When we can find common ground, I think that's so important. And when we can have a posture of humility, that's what I'm trying to do. And I mean, it gives me some grace with others because I feel like I've been on the other side of so many of these issues that, when I talk, I can appreciate that scripture that we're working out our salvation with fear and trembling, that it's not just a moment, but a lifetime of being shaped by the Spirit of God. So that's just my final lingering thought I wanted to say. So, yeah.
Thank you, Shane. Well, you've been very civil, so maybe our conversation will hopefully be a model for others.
Yeah, man. And reach out to me anytime. I'm glad to give you my information. And like I said, I learned far more from people who would push back on things that they might not see eye to eye on than people that are just going to say amen to everything you say. We don't learn as much from them. So I think that the idea of like iron sharpening iron, I'm seeing that at the Forge. It works.
Very good. Thank you again, Shane. You
Cool,
take
brother.
care. God bless.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.